Entity framework.
Hot chocolate.
Azure Cosmos.
Data.
Entity framework. Power tools.
Technology suite.
Countdown commencing. T-minus 2 minutes.
Jeremy Lickness.
Shiro Dent.
Grace Lampson.
Martha Vickers.
.NET Data. T-minus 1 minute. Thirty seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We are go for .NET Data Community Standup.
Hi, welcome to another .NET Data Community Standup. I hope everything is going fine because my computer has been running very slow since the intro started and cutting out a lot. So I've shut down Teams, which is usually the culprit, and hopefully everything will work. But if I get stuttery, then other people will have to step in. So we had a MVP summit last week, and was last week? Yeah, it was last week, and we showed some stuff with T4 templates for EF core, basically database first flow. So you're reverse engineering a distant database, an existing database, and then using T4 templates to customize the output. And we're taking some of that. I've expanded it. I'm going to go a bit slower, and we're going to show some of the demos that we showed the MVPs last week. And in addition to that, at the end, if we have time, I'll show the little Mermaid thing where we can generate entity relation diagrams in .NET Interactive Notebooks, because people seem to like that. No State of the Unicorn this week because I didn't have time to prepare it because I was trying to work on the code for this right until we hit the go live button there. So anyway, ask all your questions and we'll try to answer them. Shai usually does a really good job of answering questions and he's not here this week, so we'll do the best we can. Before we go into the demos of actually, showing T4 with EF7, Bryce, who is the person who's done all of this work on T4 stuff and general long-time T4 person, is just going to give us a quick intro and overview of what T4 is, why you would use it, and all that. Bryce?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I did all the work. I'm definitely standing on the shoulders of giants here. Let me share my screen. I think that's working. So yeah, I if I was in a live audience, I'd say who's heard of T4? Raise your hands, and who hasn't? I imagine about half the people have, and maybe half the people haven't. If you worked with EF6, the version before Entity Framework Core, you've probably ran into it a time or two. If you're new to Entity Framework with Entity Framework Core, you've probably never heard of it. And so I thought we should maybe just do like a crash course, like what's the basics of T4? What is it? How can I start using it today, even outside of EF? So T4 is actually an informal name. I think it stood for like Text Templating Transformation Toolkit or something. But everywhere inside of Visual Studio, the official name it goes by is text templating or just text templates. So here I have a new .NET Core project. I'm just going to right click and say add a new item. And if you search for text template, you'll see the EF5 stuff and EF6 stuff. And then you'll see these vanilla, like a runtime text template and a design time text template, or just a text template. Most people will probably just use this text template. I'll show you the runtime stuff in a little bit, but more as kind of a debugging tool. We do actually use it from time to time, but most of our T4 usage is this design time template. So I'm just going to go ahead and add it. Right away, if you're kind of following along, you probably notice something very different about my, why is my mouse spinning? Okay, there it goes. About my version. When you do a file new project, yours probably looks a lot like this. And that's because while all this stuff is built into Visual Studio, there was never sort of a built-in editor with proper syntax highlighting and code completion and stuff. And so the first thing you'll want to do is probably go install an extension and just search for T4. They all kind of go by that. So there's two here. I'm using the first one. You might be able to guess why right there. So
Recognize the author.
Yeah, that guy. It's not very good. I got to be honest with you. I threw it together during a Microsoft hackathon in 3 days. I didn't want to write this. The reason I did is because when I searched for T4, there was nothing in Visual Studio 2022. If you're using older versions, there's really good ones by DevArt, our friends over at DevArt who write EF providers. They have a great T4 editor. I don't know if they plan to bring that forward to Visual Studio 2022. I imagine they will. It's been around for a very long time, and they keep moving it forward. Tangible also has a really good one. But if you're on Visual Studio 2022, you get two choices here. And again, it's just syntax highlighting. It's nothing fancy. All right, so right away, I love T4 because it's simple. There's really only 4 things to learn. And so let's go through the things we see right now. These things that start with the at sign, the less than, pound sign, at sign, these are called directives. So this is a template directive. This is an assembly directive. This is an import directive. The template directive, you really don't need to worry about unless you want to use like VB or something. You can change that to VB. What's here is actually all the defaults, so I usually just delete it. Assembly is this code you're writing here needs to be compiled by something. And so it needs to know the assembly references here because this template is being processed by Visual Studio. It's running in .NET Framework. So they give you this wonderful system.core assembly, which happens to have all the link stuff in it, just so you get a good default experience. These imports are basically using statements. So any code you write as part of the template transformation, if you want to write a using, obviously you can't just write a using because that'll get put in the output file. So this is how you reference namespaces. This output is great for setting the extension. So if you want to generate JSON or XML or even another text template for some weird cascading templating, most of the time, yeah, you'll just be generating C#, which is actually the default. So you can totally delete that line if you want to generate a C# file. So those are directives. We'll look at one more directive in a minute, but I want to get to sort of the easy stuff. So the simplest thing is just called a text block. Hello world. And if I save this, Visual Studio will then run the template. And so anything you put sort of just blanket in the document goes straight to the output. So the next thing that you'll probably want to do is be able to like plug in values, right? Like simple token replacement. So we can do like hello world, the time is, and you do this by less than, pound sign, and then an equals. And these are expression blocks. You can think of these as like interpolated strings. So you can do like date time dot now, save that. There's the value at the time this template was processed.
So it's combining the static kind of text you've got there with the dynamically generated things like the date time now, right?
Yeah, and if you've ever used like handlebars or liquid, like this is just very simple token replacement. The beauty of T4 is that it's just C#. You can write any C# expression in here, and it will get processed. So you don't have to learn like with liquid, you kind of have to learn this weird Ruby-like syntax, and handlebars, you have to learn this JavaScript syntax. The beauty, like you already know C#. T4 just adds this little bit of templating syntax around C#, and you get full C# support. It actually gets compiled by Roslyn, so you get all the latest and greatest C# features. So that is a template block. And then the other thing, or an expression block, sorry. The other thing are these code blocks. So you can say like for, var equals 1. Wow, I'm like not remembering C#. X plus X is less than. Oh wait, did I do that backwards? Wow. A while since I've written C#.
It's tough to write C# using C#.
I can never write a for loop without the little, thing that writes the template for me, and then I just fill in the blanks. Otherwise,
I know,
totally
right?
forget.
Like the person who wrote this editor highlighting should like really make C# completion work. Okay, is that good? Sorry, I'm like really distracted here. And then you can pick right back up the code block and end that for loop. So if I save this, I get an error because I'm missing a semicolon. Of course, I did need that. Okay, there we go. Now I get it 10 times.
Yay.
So, and this is like really all you really need to know when it comes to T4. I'm going to show you a few more advanced things. So there's some parameters you can sometimes use. There's one called namespace hint, and this is actually really useful in C#, in Visual Studio, sorry. So I'm going to say I'm taking in this external parameter called namespace hint, and this is useful for when like you're generating C#. And I want like namespace and then some namespace here. And if I save that, you'll see it defaults to T4, and it gets that from where the text template is in your folder structure. And you can even override it by using this custom namespace property here. So like, I want to call it demo, save it, boom. So that's like the only parameter you can use. You'll see more of these later when Arthur does some demos, but this is one parameter that's provided by Visual Studio. Some cool integration there. The next thing, there's one more kind of block here, and they look kind of funny. It's a plus sign. And if you want to think of this as like a C# program, like everything here is sort of in the main method. When the template runs, this code runs. This is how you add stuff to the class with the main method. So if you want to add like a helper method here, void greet, something like this. And then you can actually continue writing code blocks in here. Oops, did I do that wrong? Yeah, I did.
I didn't know you could add code blocks in the thing at the bottom with the helpers.
Don't forget the plus when you continue going, or it'll get very confused.
Okay.
So anytime I call this greet method from up here, oh, that wasn't right though. That needs to be in a code block, doesn't it? There we go. it will output hello world. And so those are method blocks. One really, really handy tool that is good for learning all this stuff is those runtime templates we saw when we went to go file new item. And the easy way to change between the two is to change the custom tool here. So if this is the text templating file generator, the runtime one is called the preprocessor. And what this does is it spits out a C# class that you can then call with your program to run the template at runtime. So let's have a look at this. And this is where like all the magic, like you think T4 is this complicated thing, but it's actually just a glorified string builder. So if we look at, here is the class, it generates a class. If you look down here, like, oh, there's the parameter, the namespace and parameter, it's just a property. It gets it from, a field apparently. Here's that, where did my helper method go? It's got to be in here somewhere. Oh, it's probably should have been in the base class or something.
It's hidden in all the regions.
Help find the helper
There it
method.
is. It's right here somewhere. So there's my greet method. It just became a method in this class. And if you look at this transform text, this is like the main method. So it calls write. There's that namespace. And then here's the namespace hint variable. It does some fancy string formatting stuff for you. More write lines. And at the very end, it calls generation environment .toString. And if you look at the type of generation environment, it's just a string builder. And so this is super handy for debugging and kind of understanding what this is doing. And there's some helper methods in there too. If you look, I think it's on the base type here. There's some properties. One of the cool properties is that generation environment where you can temporarily switch to a new string builder. So anything that's sort of in an output block goes to this temporary buffer that you can then later do things with. It's kind of an advanced thing, but it's cool to know that you can do that. Let's see what else is in here. There's some those are the properties. Where are the methods? Anyway, there's somewhere in here. There's a write line, as you saw, and write line, kind of like a console. That's nice for like these type for loops where you don't want to switch between code and back and forth so much. You can just do like a write in here.
Yeah, you suggested that on my templates, but I didn't make the change. So maybe later when we see it, you can say, hey, change that to a write.
Yeah, it can just make the code more readable. And honestly, I think that's the hardest part of T4 is keeping your templates readable, because it's really easy to get it all kind of tangled up inside. And there's some really good strategies for that too. You know how you do like a test, like you arrange and then you perform the action and then you assert. Like if you sort of do all your configuration at the top and then like build this model that you're going to use to drive the generation and then put all your output code below that, it can really help keep these things clean. I think that's most of what I have to say.
Okay.
You may be wondering like, well, Bryce, this is all Visual Studio and Windows. Like I want to do this on Linux. I want to do this on VS Code. There's a really cool project done by Michaela, who I think is an architect on the .NET team. And it's this Mono T4 project here. And one of the things that it includes is this .NET T4 command. So just like you have .NET EF, if you install this command, you can then run a command line tool to transform these templates. And so that's cross-platform. You can run that on Linux. You can, use it with VS Code. So, and this is what we have leveraged to add new features in Entity Framework 7, Core 7.
Right. So you can use, so you can use the T4 templating in EF7 on Linux, on Mac, anywhere. Basically, it's not limited to Windows, not limited to Visual Studio or any IDE or anything like that.
Yep.
I just popped up a question. Someone asked, can the output, is it just one file or can you generate multiple files as the output of a single template?
the default experience is just one file output for one thing. When I was talking about that generation environment variable, where you could sort of generate into a separate buffer, you can then save the contents of that buffer to a file, clear it, and then start generating another one, which we had some magic in the EF6 templates. We included, you can include arbitrary stuff here at the very beginning of most of those. Like we had an include, I don't even remember what it was called. It was like EF helpers.tt include. And that had a bunch of magic to make it look like you could generate multiple files. And that's how it did it effectively. It file write all lines of code to a new file.
But you can, like in the EF stuff that I'm going to show, you can use the same template and run it multiple times to generate multiple files. So we'll see that when we get, maybe it's a good time to switch over and show some EF stuff.
Do you want me to address this real quick? Source generators in T4.
Sure, go for it.
It comes up quite a bit, and fundamentally they're two different things, right? So a source generator is part of your, I guess we would call it dev time experience, and anytime you touch a file, it can trigger the source generator to go off. There's some things it does in process too that if things go bad, it can have some cascading effects, whereas T4 is a template compiler. So it's not the same as a source generator. It's not using the source tree. And so there are nuances for that and reasons why we went with T4 and not source generators. Yeah.
Okay, so what I have here is a simple console application. It's just printing hello world. I actually have a NuGet config here, which adds the .NET 7 feed. Now this contains our daily build packages. If you go to .NET EF Core on GitHub, the GitHub repo, there's a link down there to show you how to set this up. But basically, you just need a NuGet config and stick it in your directory with the solution, or actually, you can put it anywhere and it'll find it. Not anywhere, but anywhere in the hierarchy, it'll find it. So that's pretty easy. And then once you've done that, in my CS proj here, I have then two packages reference the SQL Server to I'm going to do the Northwind database, our favorite from T4 old school. So let's do Northwind old school too. And then the design package, and you can see that both of these, even though they say preview 4, that's because our daily builds are currently branded as preview 4. So this is the daily build feed. The design package is what brings in the T4 generation stuff. And the reason this is private assets all, which has been for a while, is so that things like the T4 template generation stuff doesn't actually get deployed with your application, because you need it at design time, but you don't need it when your application's running. You can remove this, and people do that, especially if you want to reference things in the design time package. You can change this, but there is a reason that we do this, is so that your stuff doesn't get deployed when it doesn't need to be. And then last thing I have here is I've got .NET tools.json, which you put in your project directory. And this allows me to reference .NET EF just from this project. And so I can bring the daily build version of that in. And this is really useful rather than installing a preview version globally on your system. You can just have the correct version in the project you want. So I use that all the time. Okay, so that's basically the setup. Now I'm going to go to terminal here, and what I have is the normal command to scaffold a DB context, so reverse engineer a database. So I've got my connection string, I'm telling it to use SQL Server, and then I'm saying put everything in the data directory, and then I want it to force, so overwrite anything that's already there, and don't build every time I run this. Now I haven't got any T4 templates now, so if I run this command right now, we'll get the default code generation that you have always got out of, so you'll get from EF Core 6, for example. And in here you can see that we do in fact have a data directory. It's got entity types in here. I don't like the fact that it's not using a file scope namespace, so we can fix that. I don't like the fact that it's got a constructor with initializing the collection in, so we can fix that. And then we also have a context generated. So the context, again, should have a file scope namespace. I hate this null not null bang thing. So basically this is because EF core, when it runs the constructor, will automatically initialize things, but the C# compiler doesn't know that. And so it says, oh, well, that's going to be null, but it isn't really. So you have to tell it it's null, but not really. And that's how you get around that. And this null bang thing is a pretty common pattern. But you can actually do a better thing here, which we'll show when we get the T4 templates. Well, I think it's better. There's a lot of debate on the team about what's better or not. I'm going to remove this warning that we generate about putting the connection string here. You can use user secrets and all that kind of stuff, but not doing it for now. And then we've got the on model creating. I'm using data annotations here. I'm just doing Fluent API. Way too much white space in all this. So I want to get rid of some of that as well. Okay, so just to kind of prove that this does actually work, and I can access the Northwind database, which would be pretty sad if I couldn't, given that this is the default generation, but it'd be nicer to be able to actually prove it still works after I change the output. I'm going to just go to my program class here and put a little program that will load categories and products and output some stuff, load customers' orders and output some stuff, loads employees and their territories and output some stuff, and then do some update, insert, update, and delete. So trying to introduce a product called Marmaid that people here in various parts of the world may have known about. So we insert that, and then let's pretend, okay, well, it's not selling as a food. People don't want to put it on toast. So we say, oh, well, you could put it in water. So we'll change it to beverages. This thing of changing Marmite from a food to a beverage, this was a demo that Colin Meek, who was on the EF team when I first started like 13 years ago, always used to do. And I think he was Canadian. But anyway, he always just say, oh, Marmite, is it a food? Is it a beverage? We don't know, so we can change it. And you can do the same thing with Bovril, by the way. But whatever we do, it never works for Americans, so we'll go and remove it. So that's basically just to show that we have Northwind working. So you can see run this. It's going to output a bunch of stuff and do some updates and deletes. So our code is working as expected. I'm going to rename this namespace so that we can generate into that data namespace again, but we can keep the old code there just in case we want to refer back to it. And likewise, I'm going to rename that, the folder that it's in, to default. Okay, now I'm going to do something behind the scenes. So don't look for the man behind the curtains, but all I'm doing really here is I'm copying over a folder that I've prepared earlier with some templates in it. So let me go into Northwind and again, and copy that. Okay, so come back over here. Hopefully it will show up. Yep. So it showed up here. See, we have a code templates folder and an EF core folder inside that. And inside that, we have a DB context T4 template. And an entity type T4 template. We've also got a bunch of DLLs. This is just so I'm using Rider here. This is so the Rider tooling correctly resolves things in here. If there's anybody from JetBrains listening, if you could make it so we didn't need these and it would just find them in the package as a reference, that'd be awesome. Would love that. But anyway, you don't need this to make it work from the command line or anything. Not functionality. This is just to make their editor work better. So yeah, so we've got EF now will automatically pick up that I've got got a folder called code templates. I've got a folder in that called EF core, and I've got 2 templates in that. So we'll go look at the templates in a minute, but I'd want to go back to my terminal here, and I'm going to rerun exactly the same command. So you don't have to tell it on the command line, use T4 templates. It just knows, okay, these exist in my project. I'm going to pick them up, and I'm going to use them. And this is similar to patterns that exist elsewhere, where by conventions it finds things in a code templates folder. It's the T4 generation is a little slow. Hopefully we can make that faster before we release. Excuse me. Looks like we lost Jeremy as well. Hopefully they'll find us again at some point. Okay, so that's run now. So if we go back here, you see we now have a data folder as before, and we've got entity types generated in it. However, now the entity types have used my generation, which we'll look at, and so they've got a file scope namespace. I'm initializing the collection in line rather than in the constructor. And if we go look in the context template, you can see again file scope namespace. And in this case, rather than having those null bangs, what I'm doing is I'm calling a set method on the DB set directly. So what this method does is returns the DB set from the context. Now it caches, EF core caches the DB set, and so this is semantically pretty much exactly the same as when we initialize everything, but you don't end up with the getters and setters and the null bangs and all of that kind of stuff in there. It does result in a lookup for the DB set, which is negligible in pretty much every scenario I could come up with. If you really care that you don't want to look up, you could actually generate code in the constructor that sets these just like we do normally, and then you'd have a nice clean code as well. Jeremy found his way back, yay. Going down a bit further, we have less white space and stuff in the entity types in the model builder. Okay, so I'm going to go back now and actually look at the templates so we can see how some of this is generated. We have two templates. We have an entity type.t4 and a dbcontext.t4. So let's look at dbcontext first. So dbcontext is called once, and it gives you, remember Bryce showed you these parameters, so there's a namespace hint. Well, EF templates add some additional ones in. Model is probably the most important one, and it's an instance of iModel, and that's basically the same model you get when you do context.model in runtime, and it shows you all the metadata about an EF model. And this is basically what is generated by the reverse engineering engine. It looks at the Northwind database, it goes through and it creates entity types, it creates relationships, foreign keys, properties, all of that stuff, and puts it in an iModel. And then it gives you that iModel and says, right, here it is, go generate your context and entity types from there. And then we have some little helpers here as well, which set up things like services. So you have access to all the internal services, including the design time services that EF uses, and there's some like helpers for things like generating C# that we'll see later as well. So here's the actual like main chunk of the template here, the meat of the template. A few namespaces. You can obviously be smarter about which ones you output if you want to be. And then file scope namespace is simple. Just as Bryce showed in his thing, you just put namespace hint. If you were to pass on the command line a different namespace, this would show up be a different parameter in here. And so, you would put it into, instead of being in Northwind, it will put it into whatever you specified. And then we just go through and create the DB context. So options, which was another parameter we had up here, gives you things like the context name. So again, if I passed a different context name on the command line, I get a different thing in here. As it is, I got Northwind context, which is the default. It generates the two constructors like we said before, which is generally a useful thing to do. In my demo, I don't need actually either of these. And one of the great things about T4 is you don't need it, you delete it, and it's gone. So now if I were to run these again, we would not, and I will in a minute, we will not have the constructors there in the context. In fact, why not I just start it running again now, just so it's ready for later. Okay, so now what we want to do is create a DB set property for every entity type. And so I'm again using that iModel, and I'm getting entity types. And for each of the entity types, I'm just saying, okay, create me a DB set property, get the default DB set name for it, which by default is pluralized. And then put this accessor to call the set method like we saw when I showed you the code for the context. So if we go back here, you say it's regenerated, so I have no constructors now, yay. And this is the bit of code that is being generated for each DB set name. Now, I'm sure everybody knows this, but EF Core reverse engineers views and models and tables rather. And so some of these, like this, are actually views, not tables, but we've created DB sets for them. Of course, you could control that in whatever you want, either by using the command line to change what you generate, or by actually in the T4 template, you could say, if it's a view, I actually don't want a DB set for it, for example. Or maybe you have some things where there's aggregate roots that you want DB sets for, but other things that you don't want DB sets for. So you could change all that fairly easily. Okay. Next, we have the onConfiguring method. So you'll notice, again, if we go back to the template here and look at onConfiguring, it's doing use SQL Server. But there's nothing in here that specifically says use SQL Server. And this is because the reverse engineering engine integrates with, and the code generation engine integrates with the provider that you're using. And we have this method, generate use provider, which calls into the provider code to get a use SQL Server call. If you were using Postgres, it would be use MPG SQL. If you were using SQLite, use SQLite. So you can write these templates in a way that they're agnostic of the database that's provider that's being used, but still output the code for that. And there's various other things that allow that to be done in a kind of more advanced way as well. In addition, we have this code fragment thing, which is a general way of this thing is basically saying, generate a code fragment for this thing. So the code fragment thing is a kind of general purpose, quite useful thing for generating bits of code.
And the idea behind those is the providers sort of generate this syntax tree, like what .NET methods do you need to call, and then the C# can generate C# for that, or VB can generate VB for that, or F#. So the providers don't need to know about languages. Your templates don't need to know about providers. We're trying to keep all the concerns separate in here.
Yeah, it's a really good point that even though I'm showing C# and we're kind of focused on doing C# for the main product, this is all extensible. Bryce done a great job of making this really extensible so we can do, other people can write templates in VB. I think didn't you already like try that, Bryce, like a VB template?
I haven't written the templates yet, but there's currently a reverse engineer VB support third-party library.
Yeah.
Community library, I should say.
Yeah, so now on model creating, this is where the bulk of the configuration goes. Again, we're using that I model and we're getting all the enter types. There's a little bit of just code here that says don't do this for many-to-many join tables, because as everyone knows, the EF Core 5 and above, you don't need to map those. This is something that will, this is just a method that I have like down at the bottom here, which I copied directly from our code base. No, I don't understand this either. Andrew does, I'm sure. But we'll make it easier around here. But basically just saying don't generate the join tables. What we can do though is we can say, okay, some of our entity types have keys and some of them don't. Typically this is views. Typically views don't have keys, but they can. And typically tables do have keys, but they don't have to. But what you'll notice in the code that we've generated, this first thing we see here is a view, alphabetical list of products. And so we're telling it that has no key. And then we're also doing a to view to tell it map this to this view. Excuse me. If it does have a key, then again, we're using this little code helper that generates a Lambda call for either one or more key properties, which is really useful. So if we scroll down here, oh, I should have mentioned also, we've got this little thing here that you don't have to do, but this basically says if the key property name already matches the convention for EF to detect it as a key property, then don't bother doing it. Some people don't like that, and that's one of the advantages of T4. If you want to always specify the key, you can just remove this and we'll always specify the key. As it is, we have that in, and so if we go down here, we find here we've got customer demographic. Its key is not customer demographic ID or ID, it's customer type ID, and so we've done a has key to explicitly specify that. Like I showed before, we'll do a to table for tables and a to view for views. Again, we're not doing the table if it's the default. And then we go through all of the properties. And for the properties, we basically say, okay, output a call to entity.property, and then if it needs it, we want to output the column name. But if it doesn't need it, we won't. If it has a max length, we'll set that. If it doesn't, we won't. And likewise, through different things. So column type, for example. This is a little bit of a hack at the moment, which basically says these are the non-standard column types in Northwind. If it's one of these, we need to know. If it isn't, it's fine.
It's worth pointing out probably right now that this is very early work. The next big chunk of work is to write the default templates.
Yes.
So you won't have to like start from a file new, a new template. You'll actually get like, what do we do by default, and then tweak it a little bit where you want that extensibility.
Absolutely, and in general with the T4 templates, what you very often find is you get an existing template, either our defaults or one that somebody else has created, and then you'll just modify it slightly for how you want it. We would really like to make it possible for people to easily write their own templates and put them in NuGet or somewhere, such that anybody can get a template and use it, and other people can create their own templates. But early days yet on some of that stuff. Okay, so we're outputting stuff for the properties. We then go through the indexes and we generate an index, and then we want all the relationships to be configured. So we go to the relationships, and because we're getting the foreign keys, it means we're starting on the dependent side, because the foreign keys only exist on the dependent side. So we can always do has one, unless it's a skip navigation. But that in that case, the foreign key doesn't exist at all. So if we find a foreign key, we're on the dependent side. So we can always do a has one, and then if it's unique, we do a with one. If it's not unique, we do a with many, and then we configure the foreign key property in the same way. So if we go back to our code again, if we find an example with some relationships, so here, customer, what's this order? Yeah, so order has one customer with many orders, there's one employee with many orders, and has a ship via which has many orders. Okay, so those are our relationships. Remember what I said about how quite often you'll copy and paste an existing template? This is the code to do a simple join table where you have to configure various things like the foreign keys on the join table. It's a bit complicated, but most of the time you just copy and paste this and you won't worry about it. So let's see, customer. Let me find customer, because customer has a many to many. Here we go. So we're doing has many customer types with many customers, and then this is setting up that that hidden shared type entity type join table. Okay, so that's basically everything that there is in the model. So that's how we generate the DB context. As we saw, there's another template, which is entity type T4. So remember, in our data folder here, we've got the context, which we've been looking at, but then we've got a file for each of the entities in there. And so basically, those entity CS files are generated by calling this entity type template for each entity in the model. So instead of getting the I model as a parameter, you get the entity type as a parameter to this in this case. Other than that, it's the same idea, some namespaces, file scope using again. And then we just go through the entity type and say, get the properties, and we output a property for it. I've got some little helpful functions like Bryce mentioned at the bottom here. This does, null reference types are great and everything, but it does make it more complicated to generate exactly the right code for everything it used to be. So I've got a little helper thing that says, okay, if it's a value type or it's nullable, then we don't need anything. But if it's a required reference types, then we need to do this null back there. So put that in there. And I've got a thing here which says, create a type string. And this also makes sure that we add a question mark if it's a nullable reference type to it. We'll probably build those in somehow or make them easily accessible for any template. For right now, I've just put helpers there. So yeah, so we go and generate, let's open employee here. So we've got getters and setters for all of the properties. So super simple. Again, we can go through the navigations and we put in a navigation. We do a slightly different thing for required navigations than we do for optional navigations. And again, if it's a collection navigation, then we output an iCollection of the type and initialize it inline to a list. So this avoids doing this inline here avoids having a constructor where we initialize it to a hash set, which I don't like. So I'm making it a list here. And that's it basically. Oh, the same for skip navigations. Again, it's basically the same as code as we have for navigations. So that's awesome. I'm going to go to, I just want to prove that this works and I haven't messed anything up. So I'm going to go back to my program here, make it use the new code. We should be able to run this. And if everything worked, it'll come out. If not, it'll be a big bang. Oh yeah, it worked. Americans still don't like Marmite. Okay, so that's great. But you can change stuff, and that's where that's really where this becomes powerful. And I think this is much more powerful than it was in EF6 in the old stack, because EF core supports so many different more patterns in your entity types. You know, you can map to fields, you can have constructors, you can have read-only property, read-only collections, all of that kind of stuff. And so you really have a lot of different options of how you write your entity types. And I'm going to show a few of those. The first one, I'm going to actually show you making the changes to the code, and then I'll just copy and paste a few more and walk through them. So the first thing we're going to do is, if we look at our entity types here, let's look at customer, for example. The company name is required, and the primary key is required. What I want to say here is, okay, if you're creating a customer, you should always set the company name. And using this version of C#, nothing that hasn't been done that might be done in the future. The best way to do this would be to create a constructor and force the person using this to call a constructor for customer where they pass in the company name or any property that's marked as required in the model. And that's really easy to do. So let me go get some code that I wrote before here, just little snippets, so I'm not typing everything out. Here we go. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the entity type template again. Okay, so now so there's a bit more space. Okay, so in the entity type template, I want to output a constructor which uses the required properties. So what I'm going to do first is, and we need one of those imports that Bryce was saying. Ride is really nice in that it does like it does for usings. You can just do Alt Enter and it'll put it in for you into the T4 template, which is pretty cool. So what we're doing is saying from the entity type, get me the properties, anything that's required, i.e. not nullable, then I'm going to select out a bunch of things here. The property name, its short display name, and then I'm going to take the Pascal cased property name and create a camel cased parameter name for it. Okay, so now we've got that basically metadata at the top of the template. I won't claim that all my templates are pretty and nicely organized like Bryce said, but I think this is kind of what he was saying about separate some of this code out of the top and then use this later on when you're generating. So I think I did a good practice here, even if I didn't do it everywhere else. Okay, so once we've got that, we just need to put some code in to generate a constructor. So this is the top of our class, right? So this is the class for each entity type. So right at the top of here, I'm going to copy and paste some code to generate the constructor. So public and then the type name and then open the parentheses for the constructor. Now go through each of the required properties and put the parameter name, the property type and the parameter name, and then a comma after all but the last one, whatever. It's just a little trick to do that. Close the definition or declare, I don't know, whatever the the main thing at the top of the constructor, and then open the body here with angle brackets there, and then assign each parameter to each property here. That, if I've done this right, that should be all that we need. So I'm going to go back to my terminal here, going to run this again, and hopefully this will generate entity types with constructors. Now, because, like I said, EF can recognize by convention any constructors that have constructor parameters that match your properties in your model, EF is automatically going to call this constructor for you when it needs to create instance of the entity. So I haven't had to write code in here that will also generate a parameterless constructor. It just needs the code to generate the actual constructor. So here you see it's finished generating, and now we have a customer class, and it's got a custom parameterized constructor that takes the required properties. You see I've got red squigglies under here, and that's because when I switched from the default code generation to the first templates, I didn't change the shape of anything significantly, and so my application code worked fine. Now I actually have to change this because I can't just call the parameters constructor anymore. It doesn't exist. So I know on this that discontinued is required and the product name is required. Now also the primary key is required, which is not ideal that we're passing 0 in here because the key is being generated, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Likewise for supplier has a primary key and the company name is required. I could in fact make these properties read-only now that we're passing the constructor. If you don't want the entity type, if you in your domain model says you can't change these after you've created the instance of the object, they're immutable, then you could easily change the code template to not generate getters and setters on that. Okay, so I've changed my code. Now we should be able to prove that EF is calling those constructors and doing everything that it needs to do in the same way. So that shows like how quickly it was just to quickly change those templates to do something else, like add a parameterized constructor. Something a bit more interesting is actually now to say, I don't want to pass 0 here. In fact, this primary key property, this supplier ID here, is purely an artifact of my database, and I don't want it to show up in my domain models at all. There's 2 ways of doing that in EF Core. You can go full on and make it a shadow property, which completely removes it from your C# code, and we could do that. I personally find that not a very pragmatic way to go, because if you transfer your entity over to a client so it's disconnected and then try and attach it again, you have no idea what its primary key is. So you either have to send that along and bring it back, separately or whatever, or do something else, like try and find it in the database by something else. That's all complicated. But what you can do is make this a field that only EF uses. So it still travels with the entity, but it's a private field that doesn't show up in any of the public surface of your entity type. So I'm going to copy over some templates that will do that. So bear with me for a second while I find what I need here. So I've got this prepared with hidden keys. Oh, and we're also going to do the same thing for foreign keys and primary keys, because we really don't want either of those to show up in our domain model. So have I done this right? Yes, I do want you to replace the files.
One of the things I really hope that adding to this ability to do T4 templates shows is there's no one way to use EF. Like when we did reverse engineering, we had to pick one way, not because it was the best necessarily. And now that we kind of enable all these different patterns, it's really highlighting the work we've done in the runtime to support all these different patterns.
Absolutely.
Like we don't favor one over the other. We just had to pick one for the default experience.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said earlier, because EF has a lot more flexibility than EF6, there are way more things to do than there used to be when we had T4 templates in EF6. Okay, let me go back to the terminal and rerun that scaffolding. While that's running, you can see here that what I've done is I've got, in addition to my required properties, I've got my key properties here. So basically I've said, get me the keys, get me the foreign keys, select all the properties off there, don't duplicate any, and then create a list. So this is all the properties that are part of a foreign key or a primary key. Now in my class at the top, I'm going to go through, I've got a little toField name here, which is similar, takes my, it camel cases it and then sticks an underscore on it to get my preferred field name syntax. If you don't like underscores, you don't have to do this, it's T4. And yeah, so using that and then basically put the nullable if it needs to, and then write out a private read-only property for the field name. I've just seen that this is read-only for foreign keys, which it probably shouldn't be. So that's, you know, something I could fix. But I added foreign keys at the last minute on this, so it won't affect anything that I'm actually going to show. And then now when we're generating the constructor, we can do the required properties, but not if it's a key property. So this will avoid us having to pass 0 in just to say, because it's the key is a required property. So this is run now. So let's go look again at our customer entity type. You see now we have the a primary key. It's a string, strangely for customer in Northwind. And the constructor now doesn't take the primary key, it just takes the other required properties. Notice also there's no customer ID property on here. It's not like this is a backing field. This is the only thing representing the primary key in there. Why is Northwind context showing me errors? It shouldn't be doing. Oh, it's not now. It was just catching up. Okay, good. I was worried there. Let's look at order detail. It's another good example because it's got a composite key. So we've got two key properties there. And again, they don't show up here. So looking in the context, how do we do this? How do we configure this? Well, you call hasKey like you did before in EF Core, but in this case, you just give it the string name. And then you also can set up the string name here as a property. You can say category ID is a property of int. You don't actually need the int, but it kind of helps things be a bit stronger typed. And it is mapped to the category ID column in the database. So now EF is basically using this field as the key and is just writing and reading directly from it. There doesn't need to be any property. It doesn't need to be passed to the constructor. EF Core can just write and read directly from these primary key properties. Likewise, when you're configuring relationships, if I find a relationship here that isn't a many-to-many, so here we're saying has foreign key, and we're just passing the field name in here. Now, we're using strings in this case because these are private fields, and so you can't reference them from the context type. If they were public fields, you actually could use the lambda in the same way, but that's pretty unusual to have a public field in there. So we use strings here. So you do kind of lose that Fluent API type safety thing, but especially when you're generating code like this, that's not that important. Now, what we should find is that if I try and compile this, it won't compile again because I've changed the shape of my model again, but in a very good way, because now instead of passing 0 in, I'm not passing anything in. So now it knows that, okay, this product ID is going to be generated by the database. It's going to be propagated back into it. Even though it's a read-only, we can propagate it back into it. So C# will say, no, nothing's setting that, but EF is because it's an extra linguistic tool. And likewise for the supplier. So this is much more natural for somebody using the domain model now. It's not so tied to, okay, you've got primary key and you've got a primary key in your database, so it's in your domain model and everybody has to know about it and everything. So we run this. Hopefully everything works, which should show that we're writing and reading from the keys and doing that and everything's perfectly fine. So I'm gonna go and show the templates just really quickly. I don't want to. How are we doing for time here? I'm sure we're probably over already,
You've got
right?
3 minutes and I pull the cord.
We're going to run over. I mean, I don't know why we even say this is an hour, because we never finish in an hour. It's probably because if we said it an hour and a half, it'd end up going for 2 hours, wouldn't it? Anyway, so I showed you a little bit about. Oh, let's. Are we in the entity type template here? No, let's do the entity type template first. Okay, so yeah, so we looked at writing the field names. In the properties, we again don't output a property if it's contained in the key property, so it's pretty straightforward. So there's really very little changes actually needed to the entity type template to make that do fields. The context requires a little bit more. Oh, that's the context, not the template. The context template requires a little bit more. Again, at the top of for each entity type that I'm doing in the configuration, we have that basically same code that gets key properties. And then we kind of have to know, okay, if it's a field name, I want you to output a field name thing with, strings in, as opposed to if it's not a field name, then, do different things. I've only implemented 1 and 2, and I'm just throwing because that's all we need for Northwind, and I'm throwing for that. This is again something I hope we had helpers to make some of this stuff easier. And then in the relationships, again down here, we say, okay, if it's in a key property, if the index is that we're creating, for example, in this case, is a key property, then configure it with the field name, otherwise just configure it with the property name. So there's a few more changes here, but it's all pretty straightforward, and really doesn't, make the template that much harder to understand or anything. Okay. So what was I gonna show next? So I have to admit, when I tweeted 2 hours ago, I was like, what can I prepare in the next 2 hours to show? And I got as far as doing this with foreign keys, although obviously I made a mistake. I unfortunately didn't get as far as showing read-only properties, but I have done notification entities. So I'm going to show notification entities now. So let me go and copy over the templates that I've prepared for that. Notifications, code templates. Northwind. Zap that stuff. Okay. Hopefully we now have different templates. So let's look at the entity type one, because it's the most interesting. I think it's actually the only one I changed. Let me talk about notification entities for a moment. So when I say notification entities, what I mean is entities that will notify EF when a property value or a navigation value, so a relationship, changes. So normally when you have normal kind of POCO entities, there's no way for EF to know, for example, if you change the product description from blah to blah blah, because it's just code that's running somewhere else. So how EF does that is that when you call save changes, for example, it'll do this thing called detect changes. And it basically runs through and compares the current values of all those properties to a snapshot it made when you started tracking those entities, and says, oh, look, when I snapshot it, the property description was blah, now it's blah blah. I'm going to mark that property as modified, and then when you save the changes to the database, we're going to update just that property. So that's the normal thing that happens. People often say, man, you're going to go through and compare every property to something in the snapshot? That's going to be really slow. And in fact, I remember, again, like 12 years ago, or whenever we started, doing POCO entities, this was one of the big concerns we had. Okay, like snapshot change tracking is going to be way too slow. In reality, it isn't for the vast majority of people. Like it's only really slow if you've got massive amounts of entities that you're tracking and changing and updating all at the same time. For the vast majority of people, snapshot change tracking is fine. However, if you have an entity that can tell EF this entity type is changed, this property value has changed from blah to blah blah when it happens, then you no longer need to make that snapshot, and you no longer need to do the detect changes where it detects if those are changed. And having entities that do that are called notification entities. Now you can use change tracking proxies, which do basically the same thing. That proxies have their own issues. In particular, you've got to make sure you always create instances of the proxy, which requires you to change your code that creates entity instances to explicitly create the proxies. So if you don't want to do that, you can write what are called notification entities. There's a standard pattern for notifications in .NET. It's I notify property changing, which is basically calls an event handler as an event handler, an interface that has an event handler for before you change your property value, and I notify property changed, which is an event handler for after it's changed. EF needs both of these because we actually need to know that the value has changed from this to this for something like a foreign key or a concurrency token or something like that. You can get away with just doing property changed, but you still need to do snapshots and various things. So you basically want to implement both of these. A quite typical way to do this is to create a base class, which I call notifying entity, which has a method that you call for the setters, which will do these notifications for you. And then EF will hook into these events. Okay, so I've got this notifying entity class created already, and I've copied over the template. So I'm going to run, I'm going to go back to my terminal here, and I'm going to run these templates again, and we'll see what gets output, and then we'll look at the templates for it.
I'm seeing some comments, some T4 haters, which there's plenty of you out there. I want to point out that there is an existing library for doing handlebars-based templates by Tony Sneed that's been around for quite a few versions of EF, actually. And there's nothing stopping the community from doing the same thing, but for like a liquid-based template. So we chose T4 because, well, our users know C# and we don't want them to learn these JavaScript or Ruby languages. And we kind of have a history of it with EF6, but there are other options.
Yep. I mean, we did look at, we even did a Razor prototype a few years ago to see if we could use Razor templating. It was horrible. Razor's not good for generating C# code. So I think we've done our due diligence here, but T4 really is, just because it's old doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good option. And especially with pluralization and better support in editors, it's a lot easier to use than it is if you're just trying to do it in a text editor. Okay, so I've run my template. If we're looking at order detail again, you can see it inherits from notifying entity. In that now I've created fields for all the properties, not just the keys. By the way, I removed the things for keys and everything from this for simplicity. So we've gone back to entities that just have properties for keys, just so that we don't, I mean, could combine these two things together just to make it clear. So we've got fields for all of our properties, and then each property has a getter and a setter where we call this set with notify for each one. If you don't know what this call a member name is, it's a pretty cool little feature where you essentially say it's got a default value, but that's not the value that actually will be passed into here. The compiler or some part of the runtime, whatever, I don't know how it works, will actually say this is the property name. So it'll pass order ID into this, which means that then when we create this this event, this notify changing event, we can give it the property name without having to kind of hard code that into every time we call this. So yeah, so basically for notification entities, you need to do this. You call the getter and setters. If we've got an entity with relationships, for example, like customer, we're doing the same thing. These are notifications as well. They also have another difference, which is they use this thing called observable collection, which is shipped as part of .NET. And this is a special type of collection that says, okay, It provides events when you add an item into the collection, you remove an item from the collection, and so forth. So this lets you change, for example, I've added a new order to the customer. EF can now be notified and update its internal state to know that that's happened. So that's basically all you need to do. There's a small change in the context to make this EF actually hook into these, which I ran out of time to do. But you have to tell EF in its we could probably just write it in, but I'm not going to. You have to tell each EF use notification entities essentially so that it knows to expect this and hook into these. We kind of used to hook in automatically in EF6. Why we don't do that in EF core is because notification entities are all, these interfaces and events are used by other things. And most notably, UI frameworks use these for notifications too. And it's quite common to want to use them for UI, but not use them for EF. If you do that, that's fine. But then if you only have some properties that notify the others that don't, and then EF thinks you're notifying all properties, then it gets into a state where it doesn't know what's going on. So that's why we basically say, if you're using them with EF, you have to tell us, I'm using them with EF, and then EF will actually check all of your properties, all of your entity types implement this. You've got collections, observable collections, or actually notification collections, and so on. So it's kind of, we're a bit more explicit than we used to be, which I think is a good change. It's probably, my code is probably not going to compile again because I need that old code again. So I'm just going to go find that quickly here, program.cs. And bring it over here. Okay, so hopefully now it will compile and all of these entities will work. Oh, it looks like, oh yeah, something's changed in my nullable reference types, but no big deal. And so all of this works. It's not actually using the notification entities, but trust me, it does work if you configure it on the context. Let's quickly look at the templates just to see how we did that. Again, I think I showed this already, right? No, maybe not. So generate fields for everything. We call set with notify for each of the properties. Likewise with the navigations, we use observable collection. So the templates, again, just pretty straightforward. They're just not more complicated. They just change a little bit how we output things. So that's all I have for normal T4 stuff, but we're going to show some entity relationship diagram stuff with Mermaid at some point too. So should we do T4 general questions if there are any that have run by, or have you answered them all, Jeremy?
I'm on top of it all. Everything answered.
Right.
No, there may be some trailing ones, but
okay.
Nothing that jumped out at me.
Okay. Well, okay. So Bryce was demoing this to the team, and he's like, I had this kind of cool idea, right? Like, we're generating C# code out of our T4 templates, but we don't have to. We can generate other kinds of stuff. I mean, right at the beginning, Bryce just showed generating a text file, right? So you can generate other kind of stuff. What happens if we generate a markdown file, and in that markdown file, we use this thing called Mermaid, and Mermaid is a extension to Markdown that allows you to express diagrams as a Markdown text file. Did I get that right, Bryce?
Yep, that's right.
Okay.
So easy, even I can use it.
Yes. So I have the thing that Bryce created here somewhere. It's down, scroll down. Here it is. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna copy this in to the DB context template.
The reason I started thinking about this is because GitHub added support for Markdown. So it was
yes,
on my mind while I was writing all this T4 code.
Now I have to update all my repos to have diagrams in them, even if they don't need them. Just
I'm gonna
show.
delete the entity type template for now because we don't actually need it. So here you see what we're doing is we're generating a markdown file which has Mermaid ER diagram in it, and then we're outputting from here the various different types of markdown for each of the relationships. So again, all we're doing is going through this model, getting the names, getting the properties, putting it into the markdown. So it's like super simple, super easy to do. And if I go back to my terminal window here and tell it scaffold that database, it's going to, instead of scaffolding it to T4, we're going to get in our data folder a markdown file, which if I open it in Rider, you can see this is the markdown file. This is how you specify Mermaid with these things showing, the relationships basically. And then Rider has visualization for this. So we get a cool entity relationship diagram of our database. Applause,
Yeah.
yay!
You think T4 is old school. ER diagrams are even older.
Yes. And then because this is a template, we could say, actually, we want it to be simpler than that. I don't actually want the properties in there. Hopefully I've done this right. So I'm just going to remove the stuff that outputs the properties, run this again. I did this wrong on the MVP Summit, so it's my second chance. And now we look at this, we get a simpler diagram, which has all just the entity types.
Those
So
funny lines are called crow's feet. I love those things.
yeah, it looks weird to me, but this is the way you do it if you're a data person, data modeler. So diagrams, yay!
The important thing is to print it out on a large poster-sized sheet of paper, roll it up like a
Exactly.
scroll, and bring it to meetings.
Exactly, yes. So we did this, and we had a meeting with the people who do .NET interactive notebooks in VS Code. And I'm so bad because does anybody remember the name of the person we're talking to? I can't remember his name, so I apologize so much. Lovely Italian guy. But yeah, he was like, oh, well, I've just done Mermaid diagrams in notebooks. And so we're thinking, oh, well, could we like bring these together? Because I'm sure everybody knows, but if you don't know, .NET Interactive Notebooks already have integration with Entity Framework, so you can scaffold a C# code into your notebook. So it's only one step further than that to now get an entity relationship diagram for that. So I'm going to fire up VS Code and see if this works. I haven't done this since I showed it in the MVC demo, so VS Code is probably going to say it needs to update and all that stuff. But let's see what happens.
It has to load
Spin,
first.
spin,
That's the first
spin.
step.
Yeah, it's probably going to open on the other window too. Not seeing anything yet. Come on, don't let us down, VS Code.
His name was
Ryder's been doing
John
so well.
Sequarier or something. John.
Thanks, Bryce. Yes. Oh, there it is. It was just hidden. Maybe it's because I'm in presentation mode here. Let me go out of this. Exit presentation mode.
Oh no, we see everything.
Yeah, see my build. VS Code, where are... Oh, it's on that monitor way over there. Sorry, 3 monitors.
Bring it over.
Yeah. Okay. So what I have here, this is a C# interactive notebook, .NET interactive notebook. I've imported a few packages here. This one, some people asked when I tweeted about this visualization generator doesn't exist anywhere on my machine yet. I hope to make it exist somewhere. I'll probably show you the code in a minute for it anyway. And then the .NET Interactive SQL Server, that's already out there on NuGet in preview. That's what allows you to do stuff with SQL Server and indeed EF Core. And then this is the Mermaid Interactive extension that allows you to put Mermaid stuff into the notebook. So if I run this, what do you call these things? Can't remember, but this little snippet of cell, that's the word. Yeah, you run this cell. Okay, so it's installed those packages, it's automatically loaded the extensions that it needs into that. And then I can do this connect command. And this basically, you give it this the connection string to my database and pass the create DB context option to it. And it is going to reverse engineer my database behind the scenes, generate using scaffolding the entity data, the model, the context, and all the entity types, kind of just like what we were doing the rest of the time, and create me an instance of.
Can you
Sorry.
zoom in, Arthur?
Oh yeah.
Thanks.
Control plus right in VS Code. Okay, sorry,
There
I
you
forgot
go.
about that. So that's better, right? Maybe one more. We'll go real big. There you go. Yeah, so, and we've got an instance of our context here, so we can do things like run queries against it, and then, you know, take 10 results of beverages and display them, and you get the nice notebook experience here. I mean, this is pretty cool in itself. If you haven't seen this before, then this is a great way of kind of exploring your databases and doing everything. So love that. So what we put on top of that is from the Northwind model, I've got this thing that says take the eye model and create a mermaid diagram for it, and then use this mermaid markdown that exists in that extension and display it. So when we run this, what we get is an entity relationship diagram in Mermaid. So all we did, we started with a database. We didn't write any code here. We reverse engineered an EF context. Then we used the EF context model, metadata model, to generate a relationship diagram and put it in Mermaid into this. And I added a few options here just as I was playing with this. So for example, I could show tables and views, or I could do like I did in the other one with the T4 template, and saying, well, there's a lot, I don't want all of these properties in there. I just want to, you know, I don't have a big enough sheet of paper for all that. So let's make a smaller sheet of paper with just these things in it, and we get that nice ER diagram. Like I said, I really hope to make that package available, but let me just show you what code is in there. It's kind of hacked together right now. All these issues I've been investigating for everybody. Okay, here we go. Let me go to appearance, presentation mode. Okay, so basically all this does is I've got an extension method. I had copied and pasted, so I knew what I was trying to create. Let me go to my Explorer window here. It might be easier. Okay, model extensions. So I've got extension method here to Mermaid. This is what we saw in VS Code here to Mermaid. Lives on iModel, so you get that from your context.model, and take some options. And then I've got this model view generator, and we call generate on that. And we're taking the iModel, and I haven't used T4 or a templating engine for this. Could do. That would make it customizable, which would be nice, but just for simplicity to kind of get the proof of concept working, just got a string builder. I mean, like Bryce says, T4 is just a fancy string builder, right? So we're using the less fancy string builder. Tell it I'm generating an ER diagram, go through, get entity types, views if I've asked for them, tables if I've asked for them, exclude the many-to-many things again, and then just basically start writing out that markdown. If we want to show properties, go through the properties, write out the markdown for the properties, go through the foreign keys for the relationships. This is basically exactly the same code that Bryce had in his T4 template, but just put into a C# and then return that toString. So that's all you need there. Like I said, it would be great to put this out as a package. You know, if people don't know, there's our official .NET EF Core repo, which is where the official product is, and then Bryce nabbed the just EF Core GitHub repo, and that has a bunch of packages in there that are done by the community, some of them by team members. They're not supported, they're not official, but we do kind of cool things like the naming conventions, the VB and F# stuff and things like that in there. My hope is that I can put that into there so that people can then start using this as to generate Mermaid in .NET notebooks. So with that, I think I can stop sharing.
Ooh.
Okay. Well, where are we gone? How far over have we gone?
20 minutes.
Oh, pretty normal then. So that's all I have. If there's any final questions, we can certainly answer that. Otherwise, we'll come back in a couple of weeks with another thing. We try and know what we're doing next, but we've been terrible the last few times of figuring out what we're doing and who's going to be there and everything. So
Yeah, we're gonna have people, and we're gonna have a data-related topic. I know those two things.
it's going to be good stuff.
It'll be
Excellent
great.
content as always. Highly
Yes, indeed.
polished and professional. No, it's not available on my GitHub yet. I will put it on GitHub at some point. It's on my machine and a local NuGet feed on my machine. That's how I was installing into notebooks.
Nice.
Okay.
Love the notebooks experience.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. We definitely want to work with that team and help make that even better experience.
All right. Well, happy middle of the week.
Yeah. And we will say goodbye for now.
So
What do we
long.
say?
Thanks for all the fish.
Keep it sargeable. Remember, always keep it sargeable.
Sargeable.
Bye, guys.